His wife left him for her just a friend, sat him down at his own kitchen table, slid divorce papers across it while her mother watched from the couch, and told him the man she'd been calling just a friend for 2 years was the man she was choosing instead. A general partner at a $41 billion firm. A man with a Porsche, a corner office, and a building full of people who answered to him. And the husband she was leaving? A facilities manager in a work uniform who drove a truck and never once raised his voice. What his wife didn't know, what her mother didn't know, what the man she left him for had never once thought to find out, was that the ground underneath that $41 billion building belonged to a quiet man's grandmother. And when that quiet man finally opened the envelope she left him, everything changed, not loudly, not dramatically, surgically. So here is the question: what happens when the man everyone wrote off turns out to hold the deed to the empire that replaced him? If this story is already getting your attention, go ahead and hit that like button right now. It helps this channel more than you know. And if you're new here, subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Now drop your city in the comments. Where are you watching from today? We've got people tuning in from everywhere, and we want to know where you're joining us from. Now let me take you all the way back to a Wednesday evening in October, to a house in Houston's 3rd Ward, where a man came home with anniversary flowers and found his wife already dressed for someone else. Calvin Reese pulled into his own driveway at 6:47 in the evening, a bouquet of yellow roses on the passenger seat and the faint smell of a long workday still on his clothes. He had stopped at the flower stand on Alameda on the way home, the same one he stopped at every October 15th, because 8 years was 8 years, and he believed in marking things. He noticed Patricia's Buick before he even cut the engine. It was parked slightly crooked along the curb, the way Patricia always parked, like the rules of geometry were suggestions that applied to other people. Calvin sat with the truck idling for just a moment. He told himself it was nothing. Maybe Simone had invited her mother for dinner. Maybe there was news about one of Patricia's church friends, something that required a visit. He picked up the roses and walked to the front door. The house smelled like too much perfume. That was the first thing that hit him. Not Simone's usual scent, but something heavier, something applied with intention and occasion. He came through the front door, and Simone was standing near the kitchen in a dress he had not seen before. It was a deep burgundy, fitted, the kind of dress you put on when you are going somewhere that matters. She was not going anywhere with Calvin. He understood that before a single word was spoken. Patricia was on the couch, not sitting the way a guest sits, relaxed and uncertain of how long to stay. Patricia was positioned, handbag in her lap, back straight, hands folded over the clasp. She looked like a woman who had arrived early to a proceeding she had been anticipating for some time. She looked at Calvin the way she always looked at Calvin, like he was a problem that had taken too long to get around to solving. Simone did not say, "Happy anniversary." She said, "Sit down, Calvin." He looked at the kitchen table. There was a manila envelope on it, the kind with the little metal clasp, and it had the name of a law firm printed in the upper left corner. Calvin set the yellow roses down on the counter beside the refrigerator. He pulled out a chair. He sat. Simone pushed the envelope across the table with 2 fingers, like it was a document between colleagues. "I filed last week," she said. "I wanted to tell you in person." Calvin did not open the envelope. He looked at his wife, at the burgundy dress, at the earrings she only wore when she wanted to be looked at. And he asked the only question that seemed worth asking. "With who?" It was not really a question. The way he said it made that clear. Simone lifted her chin a fraction. His name is Marcus Webb. He's a general partner at Vantage Point Capital. She paused, and then she added what she must have rehearsed, because it came out too smooth. You've heard me mention him. He's just a friend. He was just a friend. The correction landed in the room, and nobody acknowledged it. From the couch, Patricia made a sound that was almost a breath and almost a word, and then she went ahead and made it a word. Marcus actually knows how to be a man. She said it the way she said most things, as established fact delivered as a courtesy to people who hadn't figured it out yet. She smoothed the front of her blouse. That's all I'm going to say. Calvin looked at his wife for a long moment. Then he looked around the kitchen. The kitchen he had retiled himself 2 summers ago, pulling up the old grout on his hands and knees over 3 straight weekends. The kitchen where he had cooked Sunday dinners for 8 years, where he had stood at that stove in the early mornings making coffee before the sun came up, because he had always been a man who was somewhere before he was supposed to be. He looked at all of it the way a person looks at a place they are committing to memory. He stood up from the table. "I'll need a box," he said. Simone blinked. Calvin. "Just a box," he said. "I don't need much." He found one in the hallway closet, the kind from a case of water bottles, still structurally sound. He moved through the house with a quiet that seemed to unsettle both women more than any argument would have. He did not slam doors. He did not raise his voice. He pulled his work clothes from the bedroom closet and folded them the way he always folded them, the way his grandmother had taught him, corners meeting corners. And he placed them in the box. He took his grandfather's Bible from the nightstand. He took his shaving kit. Then he went to the second bedroom, the one Simone used as an office, and he opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, where he had been keeping a few things since his grandmother passed. There was a rolled tube of architectural drawings, old and slightly yellowed at the edges, tied with kitchen twine. And beneath it, tucked flat against the base of the drawer, was a manila envelope, different from the one on the kitchen table. This one had no law firm printed on it. It had his name written in his grandmother's handwriting. Ida Reese's handwriting, slanted and deliberate, each letter formed like she meant every one of them. She had pressed it into his hands in the hospital 3 years ago, in the last week before she died, and she had said only one thing about it. Don't let anybody tell you that land is nothing. Calvin placed the envelope and the tube of drawings at the bottom of the box, under his work clothes, under his grandfather's Bible. He carried the box back through the house. Simone was still standing near the kitchen. Patricia was still on the couch. Neither of them said anything as he walked to the front door. He stopped once. He did not turn around. "Happy anniversary," he said. And then he walked out. He sat in his truck for a long time without starting it. The box was on the passenger seat where the yellow roses had been. The neighborhood was doing what it always did in the October evenings. Somebody's gospel radio drifting from an open window down the block, the smell of someone's dinner, a dog barking twice and then going quiet. Third Ward was settling into itself for the night, easy and unhurried, the way it always had. Calvin looked at the envelope on top of the box. He had carried it from drawer to drawer for 3 years. There had always been a reason not to open it. The grief was too fresh. The timing was wrong. He was too tired. It could wait. Ida had lived 81 years without asking anything of him he could not give. She had fed him, raised him through the hard years, taught him to be still when other people were loud. He had told himself the envelope could wait because he was not ready, because he did not want to sit with her handwriting and her words and all of what she had left behind. He had told himself that for 3 years. Calvin looked out through the windshield at the street he had driven down 1,000 times. He thought about the dress. He thought about Patricia's hands folded over that handbag clasp, already there, already waiting. He thought about the name Marcus Webb, said with such confidence, said like it was something Simone had been storing up the courage to say for a long time. He thought about the envelope. He did not open it that night. He was not ready yet. But he picked it up and held it in both hands for a moment before setting it carefully back in the box, because something in him understood, in the wordless way that some things are understood before they are known, that whatever Ida had put inside it was not nothing. It had never been nothing. He started the truck. And he drove. To understand why Calvin Rees never opened that envelope, you have to understand what kind of man he was. And to understand that, you have to go back 8 years. Calvin had met Simone at a birthday cookout in the summer, the kind where somebody's cousin has a speaker in the backyard and the potato salad runs out before the sun goes down. Simone had been in a humble season then, between apartments, between certainties, figuring out what she wanted from life. She had laughed easily that summer. She had said Calvin was solid. She had said solid like it was a compliment, and back then she had meant it that way. They married 14 months later. Calvin paid cash for the rings. He was the kind of man who carried no debt and asked for no credit. His union position with the Houston Independent School District paid him reliably, and he lived reliably within it. He owned his truck outright. He had a savings account that grew slowly and steadily, like something planted in good soil. On weekends, he fixed his neighbors' cars in the driveway, not for money, just because Brother Clemens down the street couldn't afford the shop rate, and because Miss Vera, 2 doors up, needed her brakes checked and didn't have anybody else to ask. The church respected Calvin Rees. The neighborhood trusted him. He never needed a room to notice him when he walked in. Simone noticed other rooms. The shift had not been sudden. It was the kind of change that happens the way water reshapes stone, slowly, without announcement, until one day the surface looks nothing like it used to. By their 3rd year of marriage, Simone had been promoted twice and had started keeping company with women who drove newer cars than the ones she and Calvin had. She started referring to their neighborhood as temporary. She started using the word vision the way some people use a knife, to separate what she found acceptable from what she did not. Calvin's truck was not acceptable. His work uniform was not acceptable. She said it with sighs more than words at first, and then later with words. He came home one evening still in his HISD polo, and she looked at him from across the kitchen the way a person looks at a water stain on the ceiling, like a problem that had been there too long and was getting harder to ignore. Patricia amplified everything. Thanksgiving was the worst of it, year after year. Patricia would arrive from Missouri City with her opinions packed tighter than her overnight bag, and she would install herself at the head of whatever conversation was happening and redirect it toward her daughter's potential. There was always some other man to mention. Simone's co-worker's husband, who had just made director. Her friend, Keisha's boyfriend, who flew private. Patricia never said Calvin's name with contempt. She simply talked around him until he disappeared. Calvin did not argue. That was not his way. He watched, he listened, he stayed. Then the name Marcus came into the house. It arrived casually, the way a draft comes through a door, left open, barely noticeable until you realize the whole room has gone cold. Marcus said something funny at the office. Marcus knew this restaurant. Marcus had a perspective on something Simone had been thinking about. He was just a friend from the firm. Calvin had heard the phrase so many times in 18 months that it had worn a groove. He asked about it once, directly on a Sunday evening, when the house was quiet and the gospel station was playing low on the kitchen radio. Simone had looked at him like he had said something embarrassing. "You're doing this again?" she said. "This insecurity thing." Patricia had been visiting that Sunday. She called from the living room without getting up. "Some men are just threatened by a woman with connections." She said it the way she said everything, with the authority of someone delivering a verdict that had already been appealed and denied. Calvin went back to his chair. He did not press it further. He should have, maybe. But he didn't, because somewhere underneath everything, Calvin Rees was still rooted in something both women had failed to see. A steadiness that did not come from certainty about the future, but from certainty about himself. He had learned it from his grandmother. Ida Rees had died on a Tuesday morning in September, 3 years into the marriage, at 81 years old, in the third-floor room of a hospital off the Gulf Freeway. Calvin had been there for the last 4 days. He had held her hand the night before she passed, and in one of her last clear hours she had pressed the manila envelope into his hands with a grip that was still surprisingly firm, and said what she said. He had tucked it into the filing cabinet in the second bedroom when he got home, still in his funeral clothes, still not ready. The night after they buried her, he sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and thought about the envelope. He thought about what she had said. Then he thought about the fact that he had just put his grandmother in the ground that afternoon, and that whatever was in that envelope had waited 81 years and could wait a while longer. He was not ready. He needed to finish grieving before he could think about land and paperwork and whatever Ida had been trying to tell him. So he let it sit. What Calvin did not know, could not have known, was that the man Simone had been calling just a friend was not unconnected to that envelope. Marcus Webb's world and Calvin's world had been touching each other for years without either man knowing it. The ground beneath Marcus Webb's empire had a name on it, and that name was Rees, and it had been Rees since 1971. But that particular piece of truth was still 3 years away from finding Calvin. First, it had to find the right moment. Marcus Webb did not consider himself lucky. That was the first thing anyone who spent 5 minutes with him would understand. He considered himself exceptional. He considered himself the product of vision and discipline, and an appetite for risk that lesser men could not sustain. He said these things at panels and in interviews and over dinners where other people were paying, and he said them with the smooth, unhurried confidence of a man who had repeated them so many times they had calcified into fact. He was 44 years old and he ran money for a living. Vantage Point Capital managed $41 billion in growth equity assets across a portfolio of technology, infrastructure, and energy investments. Marcus had joined the firm 12 years ago as a senior associate and climbed to general partner through a combination of genuine deal instinct and a carefully cultivated reputation that he tended like a garden. The Houston Business Journal had profiled him 2 years prior. Full page, photograph in front of the building, headline that called him one of the city's most influential financial minds. He had framed it. It hung in his office on the 14th floor at 3400 Midtown Park Drive, positioned so that it was the first thing anyone saw when they walked through his door. The building itself was his favorite prop. He talked about it the way some men talk about things they built with their hands. The glass exterior, the location, the address. He mentioned it on the first date with Simone, mentioned it in the context of where he worked, what he had access to, what his world looked like from the inside. He said the address the way people say an address when they want it to function as a credential, 3400 Midtown Park Drive. Simone had repeated it to Calvin one evening without thinking, something about Marcus describing the building's skyline view, and Calvin had registered it the way a person registers a radio station playing in a waiting room. Present, unremarkable, gone. Neither of them knew what that address meant. Not yet. Simone's transformation during those final 18 months of the marriage was something the women in her circle noticed before she announced it. She started wearing different colors, started researching restaurants in zip codes she used to call unnecessary. Her language shifted in the specific way language shifts when a person is auditioning for a new version of themselves. She started saying things like "at this level" and the kind of access and people who are actually moving. She dropped old friends quietly, the way you stop returning calls when a number no longer serves the direction you are going. Patricia noticed. Patricia approved. By the time Simone had settled on her decision, Patricia had already begun the announcement circuit at First Corinthian Baptist. She told Sister Annette after second service on a Sunday in August that Simone was in a situation with real potential this time. She told the Deaconess Board during their quarterly luncheon that her daughter had the kind of discernment it takes some women years to develop. She did not name Marcus Webb by name in every conversation, but she described him in enough detail that the name was unnecessary. The firm, the position, the address. Patricia delivered these details with the quiet satisfaction of a woman collecting on a debt she had always known was owed. She had been telling her daughter for years that she deserved better than Calvin Reese. Now, finally, she had something to point to. Marcus, for his part, moved through his days with the particular ease of a man who had arranged his life so that nothing and no one could surprise him. His Porsche sat in the reserved space on the ground level of the parking structure at 3400 Midtown Park Drive every morning by 7:15. His assistant had his coffee ready. His meetings were scheduled in 45-minute blocks because he had decided years ago that any conversation that required more than 45 minutes was a conversation that lacked discipline. He reviewed term sheets the way a surgeon reviews a chart, quickly, decisively, with the assumption that he already understood the most important parts before reading them. He had that assumption about most things. When Simone told him she had filed the papers, Marcus had nodded and said good. He said it cleanly, without sentiment, the way he said most things he had already decided. He had no particular feelings about Calvin Reese. He knew the man existed the way a person knows about weather in a city they have never visited. As a fact, with no personal dimension. A facilities manager, a union man, someone Simone had outgrown, the way people outgrow apartments and entry-level salaries, and earlier, less informed versions of their own ambitions. He filed the information about Calvin Reese and moved on to his next meeting. That was the thing about Marcus Webb. He was meticulous about the things he valued and completely indifferent to the things he did not. He had spent 12 years at Vantage Point Capital reviewing every asset the firm touched, every balance sheet, every covenant, every clause in every agreement that might represent exposure. He had a reputation for thoroughness. He had built that reputation carefully. But there were things Marcus Webb had never thought to examine. The ground lease on the building, for one. It had been in place since before he joined the firm. It renewed quietly in 2019, handled by a junior associate on the real estate team who flagged nothing because there was nothing on its surface to flag. Marcus had initialed the renewal summary without reading past the payment schedule. Why would he look deeper? The building was the building. The address was the address. It had always been there. He had never once considered whose land it sat on. That was the crack in the foundation of Marcus Webb's world, invisible from the outside, untouched for years, waiting with the patience of something that had been planted long before he arrived. Calvin Reese, alone in a rented room across town, finally reached for the envelope. Pacing begins to accelerate from this chapter forward. The slow burn is over. Calvin opened the envelope on a Sunday evening, 7 days after he drove away from the house on Tierwester Street. He was renting a room from an older man named Brother Elwood, a deacon at his church who had a spare bedroom, and the good sense not to ask too many questions. The room was clean and plain, a bed, a dresser, a window that looked out onto a pecan tree in the backyard. Calvin had lived in smaller spaces. He was not bothered by the room. He sat on the edge of the bed with the envelope in his hands for a long moment before he opened it. Inside was a folded deed, notarized and recorded, brittle at the edges the way paper gets when it has been held in the same position for 50 years. Beneath it were several pages of trust documents, dense with legal language, with the words Rees Family Trust appearing at the top of each page in bold print, and at the very bottom of the envelope, folded separately, was a small piece of notepaper in his grandmother's handwriting. He recognized the slant of it immediately, the same slant from birthday cards and grocery lists and the notes she used to tuck into the lunches she packed him when he was small. It said, "They will never expect us to hold it." So hold it. Calvin read it twice. Then he set it carefully on the dresser and picked up the deed. The parcel was listed as 34 acres in Houston's Midtown corridor, purchased in 1971 for $12,000. The trust documents confirmed that the Rees Family Trust held sole ownership, with Calvin listed as the active trustee following Ida's death. He understood the broad shape of what he was holding. What he did not yet understand was the scale. He called Deacon Elwood's door that night and asked if he knew a good property attorney. The deacon did not hesitate. He wrote a name on a piece of paper and handed it over without ceremony. Denise Harden, 30 years in real estate and estate law. She'll tell you exactly what you have. Calvin called her office first thing Monday morning. Denise Harden's office was on the 3rd floor of a building off Alameda, the kind of office that communicated everything through its lack of ornamentation. No framed motivational prints, no decorative vases, just bookshelves and filing systems and the controlled order of someone who had never once confused the appearance of competence with the substance of it. She was compact and unhurried, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the demeanor of a woman who had seen every variety of human crisis and remained, through all of it, completely unimpressed. She shook Calvin's hand, pointed to the chair across from her desk, and said, "Let me see what you brought." She read through the documents without speaking. Calvin watched her face. It did not move much. Denise Harden was not a woman whose face announced things before she was ready. But at a certain point she stopped reading and set the papers down flat on the desk and pulled her keyboard toward her and began typing. She pulled up a county records database, then a city assessment portal, then what appeared to be a corporate property filing system that Calvin had never seen before. She moved between them efficiently, the way a person moves through a room they have memorized in the dark. Then she stopped typing. She sat back in her chair. She looked at Calvin across the desk. She picked up the documents again, confirmed something on page 3 of the trust agreement, and set them back down. Then she slid everything across the desk to Calvin without a word: the deed, the trust pages, and 3 pages she had printed from her screen. And she let him look. It took Calvin a moment to understand what he was reading. The corporate property filing showed a ground lease. The lessee was listed as Vantage Point Capital Houston Holdings, LLC. The property address was 3400 Midtown Park Drive. And the lessor, the entity that owned the land the building sat on, the land the parking structure sat on, the land every one of Marcus Webb's $41 billion of daily operations moved across, was the Rees Family Trust. Calvin set the paper down. He picked it up again. He read the address a second time. He heard Simone's voice in his head. Marcus's building, 3400 Midtown Park Drive, the skyline view. He set the paper down again. Denise spoke then, in the clean, unhurried way she spoke everything. She told him that the annual ground lease payments had been auto-depositing into a Rees family trust account since 2004, $1.8 million per year, into an account that had been dormant and unmonitored because no one had known to monitor it, $12.6 million sitting untouched. She told him about the change of control clause triggered 8 months ago when a Canadian pension fund acquired controlling interest in Vantage Point. She told him about the buyout option, exercisable before 2031, allowing the Rees Family Trust to acquire Vantage Point's entire Houston entity at the 2019 assessed valuation of $214 million, against a current valuation of $41 billion. She paused. Then she said the thing that landed deepest. They left this clause alone because they never believed anyone in your family would have the resources or the knowledge to use it. The room was very quiet. Calvin sat with that for a moment. He thought about his grandmother in 1971, a domestic worker and seamstress, paying $12,000 for 34 acres of land that the rest of the world had decided was not worth protecting. He thought about the note, the slant of her handwriting, what she had known that nobody around her had bothered to find out. He felt something settle in his chest, not triumph, not anger exactly, something older and heavier and more deliberate than either of those things. He looked at Denise Harden. "What do we do first?" he said. Denise had already opened a new document on her screen. Denise already had an answer. She met with Calvin twice more that week before she was ready to present a strategy. She was not the kind of attorney who moved before she was certain, and certainty for Denise Harden required that every document was verified, every clause was cross-referenced, and every number was confirmed against a second source. She had spent 30 years learning that the most devastating legal moves were the ones that could not be challenged, and what she was building for Calvin Rees was not just a response, it was a verdict. She laid it out for him on a Tuesday morning at a small conference table in her office, 3 pages of notes organized in the precise, sequential way she organized everything. Phase 1. Invoke the change of control clause. Vantage Point Capital had undergone a majority ownership transfer 8 months ago when Northfield Pension Partners, a Canadian institutional fund, acquired a controlling interest. The Rees Family Trust's ground lease contained explicit language granting the landowner renegotiation rights upon any such event. The trigger had already occurred, the clock had already been running. All Denise needed to do was formally notify Vantage Point's board and general counsel that the Rees Family Trust was exercising that right. Phase 2. Deliver new lease terms. Denise had prepared a revised agreement tripling the annual ground lease payment from $1.8 million to $5.4 million, with a 90-day hard relocation clause attached, meaning that if the new terms were not signed within 90 days, the trust reserved the right to terminate the lease entirely and begin the process of reclaiming the property. She had run the numbers. Vantage Point's own real estate consultants, if they did their job, would price a full relocation of the Houston headquarters at a minimum of $141 million. The board would understand very quickly that they had no good options. Phase 3. File the buyout option notice as a matter of public record. This was the move that could not be undone. Once the Rees Family Trust formally filed its intent to exercise the buyout option, the right to acquire Vantage Point's entire Houston entity at the 2019 assessed valuation of $214 million. It became a legal instrument of public record. The Houston Business Journal covered corporate filings. So did the SEC's material risk disclosure requirements. The filing would travel. Denise said this without pleasure, simply as fact. It would travel, and there would be nothing Marcus Webb or his firm could do to stop it. Calvin listened to all three phases without interrupting. When Denise finished, he sat with it for a moment. Then he said, "Let's go to the bank." First Heritage Bank on Alameda confirmed the Reese family trust account balance that same afternoon. $12.6 million accumulated over 7 years of lease payments that had been depositing into an account nobody had monitored because nobody had known to look for it. A bank officer named Gerald walked them through the account history with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned long ago not to show surprise in front of clients. Calvin signed the activation documents to restore full trustee access to the account. Gerald slid a confirmation sheet across the table. Calvin folded it once and put it in his jacket pocket. He did not look at the number again. He did not need to. Back in Denise's office the following morning, Calvin reviewed the change of control notification letter. It was 2 pages. The language was clean and formal and merciless, in the way that legal language is merciless, not through cruelty but through precision, leaving no room for interpretation or appeal. He read it through twice. He made no changes. He signed where Denise indicated. Then he made one request. He asked that the certified letters go out on a Wednesday. Denise looked at him across the desk. She understood without asking. She made a note on her calendar and said it would be done. There was no celebration in the office that morning, no satisfaction expressed out loud, no dramatic pause to mark the moment. Denise moved directly to the logistics of certified delivery, the specific names at Vantage Point Capital's board, the General Counsel's direct address, the return receipt requirements. Calvin watched her work with the same quiet attention he brought to everything. When the meeting concluded, he thanked her, shook her hand, and walked out to his truck. He drove back to Brother Elwood's house. He ate dinner. He went to bed. Monday morning he pulled on his HISD uniform, the same one he had worn for 11 years, and drove his truck to work. He fixed a drainage issue in the gymnasium at Jefferson Davis High School. He replaced 3 fluorescent bulbs in the main corridor. He ate his lunch in his truck, listening to the radio, the same way he had eaten his lunch for 11 years. Nobody looked at him differently. Nobody knew anything had changed. On Wednesday morning, Denise Harden dropped 2 certified envelopes into the outgoing mail at her firm's courier station. They were addressed to Vantage Point Capital's Board of Directors and General Counsel, respectively, at 3400 Midtown Park Drive, Houston, Texas. Somewhere across town, a letter was in transit, addressed to a building that sat on Calvin Reese's land. Wednesday morning, Vantage Point Capital's General Counsel signed for a package. His name was Raymond Okafor, and he had been the firm's top legal officer for 9 years. He was a methodical man who rarely panicked. He read the letter once, set it down, read it again, and then picked up his phone and called the head of facilities without saying good morning first. By noon, the conference room on the 12th floor was full. The facilities team had pulled the original ground lease and the 2019 renewal documents within the hour. The clause was there. It was real. It was binding. One of the junior associates on the real estate team kept saying it was standard language, that nobody exercises these things, that it was essentially dormant. Raymond Okafor told him to stop talking. The clause was not dormant. It had been activated the moment Northfield Pension Partners closed their acquisition 8 months ago. The Reese Family Trust had the legal right to renegotiate, and they were exercising it. There was nothing to challenge. The meeting ended without a resolution because there was no resolution to reach, only a problem sitting in the center of the table that was not going away. The second letter arrived 4 days later. It was the new lease terms. $5.4 million annually, triple the existing payment with a 90-day hard relocation clause attached. If the terms were not signed within 90 days, the Rees family trust reserved the right to terminate the lease and begin reclaiming the property. Raymond Okafor immediately retained an outside real estate firm to assess the cost of relocating the Houston headquarters. The assessment came back at $141 million minimum. The board convened an emergency session. Every option on the table was expensive. Sign the new terms and absorb a $3.6 million annual increase. Relocate and absorb a 9-figure hit. Challenge the clause legally and spend years in litigation with uncertain odds while the uncertainty itself scared off investors. Marcus Webb, who sat at that table and called the firm his, did not have a solution. Nobody did. Then came the disclosure requirement. Vantage Point Capital's compliance team flagged it within the week. The lease dispute constituted a material operational risk under SEC guidelines. It had to be disclosed in the quarterly limited partner update. The language in the document was measured and clinical the way legal language always is, but the investors reading it were not clinical people. They were people who had committed billions of dollars to a firm whose headquarters sat on ground it did not control under a lease clause that had gone unidentified for years. 2 letters arrived within days of the LP update going out, one from the endowment office of a major Texas university, one from a public employees' pension fund in the Midwest. Both letters expressed concern. Both letters requested a formal explanation. Neither letter used the word confidence. The board opened an internal review. The question was simple. How had the change of control clause been missed in the 2019 renewal? Someone had reviewed that renewal. Someone had initialed the summary sheet. The paper trail was not long. It led directly to Marcus Webb, who had overseen the 2019 lease renewal as part of his operational responsibilities for the Houston office. The board placed him on administrative leave pending the outcome of the review. His $3.9 million carried interest allocation, which he had already been discussing with Simone as a near certainty, was suspended. Calvin heard none of this directly. Denise called him once a week with updates, precise and short, the way she did everything. He listened, asked 1 or 2 questions, and went back to work. He ate his lunch in his truck. He fixed what needed fixing. He was the same man he had always been, doing the same job he had always done, and nobody around him knew that 3 miles away, a $41 billion firm was unraveling one certified letter at a time. Then Denise filed the buyout option notice, public record, Friday morning. By noon, it was indexed in the Houston Business Journal's corporate filings database. A reporter saw it before the close of business and recognized the address, 3400 Midtown Park Drive, Vantage Point Capital's own headquarters, and understood immediately what she was looking at. The article went up Friday evening. By Saturday, it had been shared 800 times. By Sunday morning, it was on social media, carried by accounts that had nothing to do with business journalism, traveling through the networks where people who knew Simone Miles Rees spent their Sunday mornings. Her friend Keisha texted first, then Devon, then a woman named Rochelle, who Simone had not spoken to in 2 years, but who had apparently been watching from a distance. Each message contained the same screenshot of the same article. Each message said some version of the same thing. Isn't this Calvin's family? Patricia received a screenshot from Sister Annette at 11:47 on Sunday morning, 40 minutes before she would normally be in the second pew at First Corinthian Baptist. She read it on her phone in the kitchen of her house in Missouri City. She did not respond to Sister Annette's message. She set her phone face down on the counter and stood very still. Marcus called Simone that afternoon. His voice was controlled but tight, like something wound too close to its limit. Simone didn't say much. When she hung up, she typed Rees Family Trust Houston, into her phone's search bar. The filing came up immediately. The trustee name was listed in plain text: Calvin D. Reese. She stared at the screen for a long time. She did not call her mother. She did not call Marcus back. She sat in the house where she had served Calvin his divorce papers 6 weeks ago, holding a phone that had just told her exactly who she had been sleeping next to for 8 years, and she said nothing out loud at all. Marcus Webb was already making a different call. He was not calling his board. He was not calling Raymond Okafor. He was not calling the outside attorneys who were being paid to manage the situation through proper channels. He was calling Calvin Reese. He wanted a meeting. Calvin agreed to the meeting on one condition. It would be held at Denise Harden's office, not a restaurant, not a neutral conference space downtown, not anywhere Marcus Webb chose. Denise's office, her table, her rules. Marcus agreed. He didn't have much leverage left to negotiate with. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning at 10. Calvin arrived at 9:30, the way he arrived everywhere, early, unhurried, wearing a clean shirt and the same quiet expression he wore to work every day. Denise was already at the table with her notes organized in front of her. She asked Calvin if he wanted coffee. He said no. They sat and waited. Marcus arrived at 10:05. He came through the door in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's car payments, an attorney named Fletcher beside him. Young, well-dressed, carrying a leather portfolio that he held like a credential. Marcus scanned the room once, taking inventory the way he always did, and then he arranged his face into the expression of a man who had come to be reasonable. He took the seat across from Calvin without acknowledging him by name. He told Denise that his client believed there was room to resolve this matter quietly, to the benefit of both parties, before things escalated further. Denise looked up from her notes just long enough to say that the matter was already resolved. The filings were filed. The process was in motion. There was nothing to quietly resolve. Fletcher opened his mouth. Denise did not look at him. She said that if he had a procedural objection, he could file it with the appropriate court, and they would address it there. Fletcher closed his mouth. Marcus leaned forward. He said he was prepared to offer a significant settlement, a figure that would make the least dispute disappear, that would compensate the Reese family trust generously, that would let everyone walk away clean. He said the number. Calvin looked at him for the first time since he had walked in. He said, "I don't need your money, Marcus." He said it the same way he said everything, without heat, without drama, like a statement of simple fact. And then he opened the folder in front of him and he began to speak. He told Marcus that he had been in Simona's life for 2 years before that October evening. 2 years of being called just a friend while he parked his Porsche in a garage on land that did not belong to him. He said he knew about the anniversary dinner Simone and Marcus had planned. For the night, she served Calvin those papers because Simone had mentioned the reservation the week before without thinking about who she was telling. He said he knew what Patricia Miles had told the church mothers at First Corinthian Baptist, because those things travel, and the Third Ward is not as far from Missouri City as some people like to pretend. He said he had spent 8 years in a house where his work uniform was treated like evidence of a character flaw, where his truck was a source of embarrassment, where his patience was mistaken for limitation and his silence was mistaken for defeat. Then he looked directly at Marcus Webb and he said the thing he had come to say. "You told Simone that you built something. You let her believe that the man she chose was standing on solid ground. What nobody in that room knew, what you yourself did not know, was that every single morning you walked into that building and called it yours. You were walking on my grandmother's land. She bought it in 1971 for $12,000. She held it when nobody thought it was worth holding. She wrote the clause that just ended your career into a contract that your legal team never bothered to read carefully because they never once considered that a black woman from the Third Ward would have the knowledge or the resources to use it. He paused. She did, and now I do. You didn't run a $41 billion firm. You ran it on a lease I own, and per the contract my grandmother signed the year before you were born, I own the building too. The room was completely still. Fletcher attempted to speak. Denise put one finger on the table, and he stopped. Marcus's expression had been shifting in stages throughout the monologue, the controlled performance cracking at the edges, something underneath it that looked, for the first time, like fear. He offered double the original settlement figure. His voice was still level, but it had lost its texture, the smooth, professional finish gone, something raw underneath it now. Calvin shook his head. Marcus offered triple. Calvin closed his folder. He stood up from the chair with the unhurried ease of a man who had nowhere urgent to be and nothing left to prove. He looked at Marcus Webb one final time, at the expensive suit, at the attorney beside him with the leather portfolio, at the whole carefully constructed theatre of a man who had confused occupying something with owning it. "The buyout proceeds as filed," Calvin said. "Denise will handle everything from here." He walked out of the conference room. In the hallway, seated in one of the chairs along the wall, was Simone. She had come because Marcus told her about the meeting, and she had needed, for reasons she could not have explained, to be near it. She had arrived 20 minutes after it started and taken a chair in the hallway outside the glass partition, where she could see the room, but could not be seen unless someone looked directly for her. She had heard everything. Calvin walked past her without stopping. He did not look at her with anger. He did not look at her with satisfaction. He looked at her the way a person looks at a place they used to live, with recognition and with the clear-eyed understanding that they are never going back. Behind the glass, Marcus Webb sat at the table with his attorney and did not move for a long moment. He had walked into that building for 6 years, calling it his. He had never once thought to check whose name was on the land beneath it. The legal machinery completed itself without Calvin having to lift another finger. That was exactly how Denise had designed it. 6 months after that Thursday morning in her conference room, the full accounting of what had happened to Vantage Point Capital and everyone connected to it was a matter of public record. The firm's new ownership, Northfield Pension Partners, the Canadian institutional fund that had acquired controlling interest and unknowingly triggered the whole sequence, signed the relocation agreement in November. They had no other viable option. The cost of moving Vantage Point's Houston headquarters out of 3400 Midtown Park Drive came in at $138 million. The shareholder loss disclosure went out in the next quarterly report. The Houston Business Journal covered it on the front page of the business section. Marcus Webb was not there to see it. The internal governance review that began with the lease oversight had surfaced additional irregularities, inconsistencies in his educational credential disclosures that had been sitting in his personnel file for 12 years, unexamined. His Wharton Executive Program certificate, listed prominently on every firm biography and board presentation, represented a program he had enrolled in but never completed. It was a quiet exit, no press release, no farewell email to the firm's investors. One week he was on administrative leave, the next week his name was gone from the website. Houston is a city that moves fast and forgets slower, but some things it does not forget. Marcus Webb relocated to Atlanta by the end of the year, and the people who had known him in Houston spoke his name in the past tense. The divorce settlement was finalized in December. Simone's attorney had argued for a share of trust assets on the grounds of marital contribution. Denise handled the response herself in 2 paragraphs, citing the trust's establishment date of 1971 and the legal definition of separate property under Texas Family Code. There was nothing to contest. The trust had existed for 50 years before Simone Reese entered Calvin's life, and it would exist for 50 years after. The settlement gave Simone the house on Tierwester Street, the furniture inside it, and whatever she intended to do with all of it. Calvin took nothing from the house except what he had packed in that water bottle box on the night of his anniversary. Patricia Miles stopped attending First Corinthian Baptist sometime in January. Sister Annette mentioned it to the Deaconess Board. Nobody pressed the matter. Calvin did not exercise the full buyout option. He and Denise had discussed it carefully over 2 meetings in late October. The option gave him the legal right to acquire Vantage Point's Houston entity at the 2019 assessed valuation of $214 million against a current worth of $41 billion. It was on paper the most devastating move available. But Calvin was not interested in running a private equity firm. He was not interested in the spectacle of maximum destruction. He was interested in something more precise. Denise negotiated a buyout option surrender, the Reese Family Trust agreeing not to exercise the acquisition right in exchange for a negotiated payment of $74 million from Northfield Pension Partners, who understood clearly that paying $74 million to make the option go away was far cheaper than the alternative. The wire cleared on a Tuesday morning. Denise called Calvin at work to confirm it. He was in the middle of replacing a broken thermostat in a school gymnasium. He said thank you and went back to work. He established the Ida Reese Community Land Trust 3 months later, capitalized with an initial commitment of $40 million from the Reese Family Trust. The mission was specific: acquire and preserve affordable housing land in Houston's 3rd Ward and adjacent neighborhoods, using ground lease structures to keep properties permanently affordable regardless of market pressure. He named it for his grandmother not because she would have wanted a building with her name on it. She would not have, but because the model itself was hers. She had understood that land held in trust could not be sold away from the people who needed it. She had lived that principle in 1971 when nobody was watching, and now it would keep living in the 3rd Ward long after both of them were gone. Calvin returned to his HISD job for 1 more year. He showed up in the same uniform. He drove the same truck. He ate his lunch the same way. He retired quietly at 44 with no announcement and no party, just a card from the facilities crew and a handshake from his supervisor who told him they'd never replace him and meant it. He was at a housing committee meeting for the Ida Reese Community Land Trust on a Wednesday evening in March, when a woman across the table asked him a practical question about a zoning variance on a property the trust was considering in Sunnyside. She had done her homework. She asked the question directly, without preamble, the way people ask questions when they actually want the answer. He gave her a direct answer. She had a follow-up. He answered that too. After the meeting ended, they stood in the parking lot for 20 minutes talking about nothing urgent. The neighborhood, the process, a barbecue place that had just opened on Scott Street that she said was worth the drive. She laughed at something he said, an easy laugh, unperformed. He laughed back. He drove home through 3rd Ward in his truck with the window down, the October air coming in warm and familiar, the neighborhood doing what it always did in the evening. Somebody's music, somebody's porch light, the particular smell of a city that knows who it is. He passed a construction site on Elgin Street. Chain link fencing, foundation work, a sign on the fence with the name of the project and the developer, and, in smaller print at the bottom, the notation that the land was held in trust. Reese Family Trust, established 1971. He drove past without stopping. Some men's power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need a press release or a confrontation or a moment where everyone finally understands. It waits, it holds, It plants something in the ground when the world says the ground isn't worth planting in, and then it lets time do the rest. That's what Ida Reese knew. That's what the land made. Now, before you go, what would you have done in Calvin's position when you found out what was in that envelope, when you saw that address on those documents? Would you have done exactly what he did, or would you have moved differently? Drop your answer in the comments right now, because I read every single one, and I want to know your thinking on this one. If this story moved you the way it moved me to tell it, go ahead and hit that like button. It takes 1 second, and it means everything to this channel. And if you are not subscribed yet, please do that right now so you never miss a story like this one. We have more coming, and they are worth staying for. I will see you in the next one.